OhioHealth Hospice, we have had a formal school-based grief support program for the last 16 years. And so I want to just let you know that through that program, we have provided individual and group grief support to schools in Central Ohio, again, for the 16 years. And through that, we recognized over the last few years that we did need something a little more formal in terms of our postvention kind of response to schools. So we also provide that crisis response, and now we have a team called the Respond Now Postvention Network that includes the folks from our team on OhioHealth Hospice, which are the bereavement counselors. We also have school counselors, school-based mental health professionals, clinical counselors, prevention specialists, and of course the team at Nationwide Children's Hospital. So that's just a little bit about our organization.
Great. And this is John Ackerman. I'm the Suicide Prevention Coordinator at Nationwide Children's Hospital. It's a real honor to be here with Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, Austin, and Lauri, and also point out that there was a previous webinar that focused on the immediate postvention response that is also archived. And so that was done by Denise Monty-Graham from Franklin County Laws and Lauri Yersavich as well. So real briefly about our program at Nationwide Children's, our Center for Suicide Prevention Research. We do a lot of school and community outreach. Our major focus is implementing evidence-based suicide prevention programs throughout Central and Southeast Ohio in a sustainable way that allows a shift in school culture around mental health and suicide prevention. And we also know that there aren't enough supports for kids who are in need and who identify at risk. So really another part of our effort is to expand the training and resources for counselors and clinicians around screening, risk assessment. And then we've done some other things with promoting responsible reporting by the media, and also part of really the OhioHealth and Lauri's network in responding to postvention. So and we're also doing more work around screening for suicide risk in primary care and other things. But today we really wanted to focus on the postvention practices that schools can use in the subsequent weeks and years following the suicide of a student. We want to focus on strategies for effective long-term postvention planning and implementation. Talk a little bit about our lessons learned in both the short term, the near term, and the months and years after a suicide, because we know that ripple effect continues after the immediate response occurs. And then talk a little bit about key considerations to keep students safe, really support that grieving process. Lauri's really the expert in that. And then talk about anniversaries, memorials, and some of the tensions and controversies that we'll face in that. So that's our goal today, and hopefully we use our time efficiently, and we want to hear from you all as well. So please use that chat box if you get a chance. And just to kind of catch everyone up, because I know some of this was addressed in the previous webinar, I do want to first define what we're talking about. When we talk about postvention, it's a term coined by the modern founder of suicidology, Edwin Sneidman, and what we're really talking about is those planned interventions that help grief and grief processes and healing. It now includes also goals for stabilizing the environment, reducing potential for trauma, and decreasing risk of contagion. Postvention is not just one intervention, but really a coordinated effort to enhance the support for the many individuals affected by suicide. And really, throughout that process, there's going to be a tension between balancing the commemoration of the young person who died with the safety of the school. So this balance could really look different for a different school culture and a school that's been affected by one suicide or multiple suicides, but we're never going to lose sight of the safety and the honoring of the person who lost their life. So the goal is not to erase the person who died, nor is it to glorify the method of suicide, death, and we need to talk about suicide in our schools. So it has to be something that increases awareness, hope, and healing throughout this entire process. So that's something we really want to make sure we're focused on. Real briefly, I think those of you who are tuned in know that postvention is important in schools, but when a student dies by suicide, it's often unexpected, especially of a very young person. So, we have several priorities that emerge from that. And the school needs to support both the grieving of all the individuals involved, including staff, and a return to a safe and healthy learning environment. And then we know that when students lose a peer to suicide, they're actually more at risk for both a lot of mental health symptoms, but they're also at risk for suicidal behavior. And we won't get into all of the nuances in suicide contagion, but it does involve behavior that's being modeled to others. And if it's really glorified or seen as a way to escape from pain or cope, or the school responds in a way that suggests this is an effective way to navigate distress, then that's really problematic. And we have seen lots of examples locally and nationally of folks not covering this topic particularly well. So that's part of the impetus behind our journalism reporting efforts. And then we do know there's lots of data that suggests that this behavioral contagion does enhance the chances of a suicide cluster, especially in the subsequent weeks, but also around anniversaries and when salient emotional triggers are present. We really need to be looking out for these types of situations and when behavior is spreading among peers. Again, the goals of this postvention are listed here. We're going to promote that healthy grieving, minimize those adverse mental health outcomes, reduce contagion, and then also very importantly from a school perspective and actually the student's mental health perspective, restoring equilibrium, making sure that things are getting back to normal within those weeks afterwards. In the first couple of days, really, it's okay to pause things. It's okay not to feel like you need to get every box checked and feel like you need to get every test taken and things like that. We have to kind of back off those expectations. And unfortunately, I've heard some schools say, these kids the very next day should get right back to work, or I think they're milking it, or I'm not sure, but I mean, Lauri will get into this very well, that there's not a set timeline for kids to grieve. And there's certain kids who are going to be more vulnerable and less vulnerable. So restoring that equilibrium is important, but not to the detriment of the grief process. Then improving the functioning of students and staff. Again, we'll just highlight that staff are not immune to the effects of loss, and we'll really want to make sure they're being taken care of as well. And so many myths and misconceptions about suicide exist. I'm sure those of you who are on the line here can give me a pretty extensive list, but we need to make sure that folks know that that suicide can be prevented with the right tools, the right response. But we aren't in the business, especially after a suicide, of shaming or blaming those who are left behind. So it's very important to emphasize moving forward. We're going to work on safety and understanding, and not blaming and shaming other folks, and do that in a really compassionate way. And then encourage that help seeking. It doesn't need to be handled by the students themselves in isolation. This is a real opportunity to open the doors of the school and connect with all the folks who are involved in providing that support. And then really lastly on the side, that good postvention is good prevention. So we'll wrap up the webinar with a overview of what can be done in the months and years afterwards, because the stage is set by a good postvention response, by a compassionate understanding and response to the person who died, is a way of showing that your school community is trying to understand this, trying to move forward, and is going to honor the person who died without unnecessarily romanticizing it. So a few guiding principles that we like to think of when we're talking about any postvention process, both immediate or long-term. These following principles serve to guide a school's decision-making throughout the postvention process. So schools should really seek to treat all student deaths in the same way. The life of the student who died should be honored, understanding that the grief of everyone around them is a natural reaction, and that it's different than depression, and that the community can focus on healing and support, and that's a really helpful thing. This helps reduce the stigma and sets the stage for open discussions about suicide, risk factors, warning signs, treatment, and then future preventative measures. The specific steps that we take to honor that student that died by suicide matters due to our growing understanding of contagion as well. We have to acknowledge that suicide deaths do confer additional risk to vulnerable individuals, and that risk is really hard to predict on an individual level. But we do know pretty clearly that a suicide does increase the risk of others when the death itself is glamorized or responded to in unhelpful ways, and we need to have plans to account for this risk. We also know that suicide is complex and never explained by just one event. I think in our natural efforts to uncover why and reduce confusion of those who have been infected, we really have a tendency to oversimplify and assign blame. And unfortunately, this at best is inaccurate, and at worst, it's deeply hurtful to those who feel blamed or scapegoated. You see a lot of this with situations where there's been bullying or cyberbullying, or situations where a person's felt rejected, and we like to simplify it. We like to give it a soundbite and a clear explanation when that's rarely the case. Suicide should really be described as a largely preventable rather than inevitable consequence of a certain event. And this is always a tough one. I'll just, in a brief commentary here, especially when you're dealing with just in the days and weeks after a loss. It's important probably not to hit this message so hard that like every suicide is preventable, or what do we do? There needs to be a shift from that sort of go get them prevention mentality to we need to support the grieving here. Yes, many suicides have given us opportunities to intervene, but not all. And many people have done an amazing job in those settings to prevent suicide. And so it really needs to move towards a message that we can always do better. For example, within our hospital system, we are always evaluating the gaps in our care. And I think that's something that we can do in our schools as well. And then just encourage those ongoing efforts. So as we prepare, and again, this is a partial review from the previous webinar. Few people really do their best work during an emotional crisis. I certainly don't. And so typically planning and decision making should occur well before an event like a student suicide occurs. So we need to be really planful about this. And so we as folks supporting a school or providers do our best work when we've developed and practiced our implementation in advance. So really think about taking this back to your community if there's not already a clear postvention plan in place, and have those discussions about what can be done next, so that it can be rehearsed and folks know what to do when. There is, in terms of lessons learned, a school dealing with this and trying to figure out, even if they're using the wonderful resources we'll talk about, like the After Suicide Toolkit or the book Suicide in Schools and other things, if they're encountering this for the first time, it's hard to pull together all those resources and know the sequence of how to do this. So you really want to have this conversation before, and it's not in the slides, but we should all know that no school is immune to suicide risk. We've been in literally at this point hundreds of schools, and we haven't encountered one that didn't have kids that and a not a small fraction of kids who experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors and need support. So this isn't a does your school need to think about this? It's how are you going to think about it, and what policies are going to be in place to support this. The other piece is we really want to have broad partnerships with the community. I think that is the cool thing about working with OhioHealth and Franklin County Loss and Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation and Franklin County Suicide Prevention Coalition. There's lots of folks on Columbus City Schools, private schools. We've got lots of folks on board working together and figuring out how we're gonna tackle this, because it's definitely not each person who's affected by suicide is going to grieve and need support in the same way. So we have to have a broad representation of our community partners. And then, knowing what your own community is like as well. So exploring what are the risk factors of the school community? What are our protective factors? What do we do really well? And that varies by community and by resources. Certainly, again, I think we talked about clarifying policies on crisis response, making sure that's not something you're doing right after a student suicide. So I think that's good. We also know, I will say also at this point, there's not really a wonderful science behind postvention. It really is a expert consensus and clinical experience process that's driven us to a lot of the recommendations that we're going to go through here. I would love much more broad research in this area and really pinpointing what efforts have the best long-term effects, but I would say we are not there. So in that case, we need to take these expert recommendations, but also mesh them with the existing school policies. That's really important to work with the school in advance to help them fit what we're going to do with their policies.
And we do have our first question in the chat box from Tina Thompson. Is there any type of outreach to homeschoolers?
So that is a fantastic question. We have thought a little bit about that, but we currently don't have any postvention processes there. We would recommend, and I'll let Lauri weigh in on this, we'd recommend certainly connecting with the Franklin County Loss Program. We have individual outreach. There's practitioners and counseling options and grief support, but we don't have an extensive programming option for homeschoolers right now, but that's something to think about.
Yeah, I think on the prevention side, the parents who are providing homeschool education for their students, for their children, need to be, kind of doing some research on their own and knowing about, mental health awareness, mental illness, to do some of the preventive factors and be proactive there. But as far as the grief support, it's what is available in your community. And looking at like a local loss team or a hospice that's providing bereavement support, or some of those mental health agencies that may have bereavement and crisis response for that family or for those who may know that child.
That's great. And I would say also from the prevention standpoint, when we get to that, we often do community events, and we've talked about things like that. If you contact us, we're happy to link you up with that opportunity, because I do think homeschooling is a gap right now.
There's definitely a gap. Thank you for that question.
So talking about the first weeks after a student suicide, because again, we covered that immediate crisis response in the previous webinar, the days immediately following are going to be really challenging. And so even after we've done the group processing and announced it to the kids and gotten the community involved, schools need to continue to explore how families and friends are making sense of this tragedy. We need to know where they're doing it, whether it's in person, online, in community forums, so that we can support the resources in those areas. There are a lot of cultural factors. It could be its own webinar involved in interpreting how groups will mourn a suicide. And we want to understand which students are moving forward and which are struggling. We've unfortunately locally have managed some suicide deaths in different cultural communities and folks where English is not the first language. Columbus has a rich refugee and immigrant population. So being able to connect with faith leaders, making sure we're using cultural brokers to help with this process, and then also that we're navigating faith-based circles, because that's really, when you're dealing with any form of death, the way that a faith-based group makes meaning of that is really important. So we need to be super respectful of that. And then understanding that the primary function of a school is to educate and to provide opportunities for kids to learn. So moving back to that, reestablishing the routine without stepping on a student's grief process, I guess, is a way to think about that, and that many youths will benefit from clear expectations, emotional security, and structure to move forward, and that you're going to have kids grieving in different ways. So universally making everyone grieve the same way or expose them to the same information about the student who died isn't always the most helpful. So we're going to be thinking a lot of times in smaller groups and opportunities to make sure that grieving and those reminders are done in an area where kids have choice about whether they're exposed to it or not. So that's a big discussion there, but I'll talk a little bit about that here with memorialization. Again, this is actually one of the slides that can kind of cut across both the immediate and the long term. So every school is going to be better set up if they have advanced communication and guidance and policies around memorialization. remember getting into this space, and memorials following a suicide is probably one of the more confusing things to make sense of, to be honest, because you've got this message that says, treat every student death the same way, except certain ways that we respond to a student suicide can be problematic and can actually glorify and romanticize a student suicide. So we want to make sure that we're vigilant about contagion, the way our messaging happens. But we also know that we need to honor and mourn the young person who's died. And so we want to do things in a very consistent way of all forms of death, so that we're not increasing stigma unintentionally. We do kind of, part of those pieces are that we want to understand that kids are going to have times when they plan spontaneous memorials, and we need to handle this on a case-by-case basis, but provide guidance in that space, because kids are going to sometimes take the approach that this is something they can't understand, it's something that hurtful, or it was selfish, or it was all of these sort of misconceptions about the way suicidal thinking and behavior occurs, but they're just trying to make sense of it. So it's trying to be compassionate about it, but also letting them celebrate the person without, again, it being sort of a constant reminder and in the space. So there's lots of good suggestions. I know that After a Suicide Toolkit has a nice section on memorials that they've actually amped up a little bit. But it does involve typically having that space for individuals to write notes. There were a couple of good suggestions that they talked about where because a lot of these things are permanent or banners, you use almost like a sticker or a note approach where something can be taken off if it's deeply offensive or hurtful to the loved one. And then also not necessarily keeping that in the central area of the school. Again, these are guidelines and subject to the school's culture, but it can be really problematic if you have someone who is kind of taking their own grief pathway, and it's they have this big message right in front of them, or there's t-shirts being worn in the school, and there's things that a person can't get away from if they need to. So really making sure that the memorials, if possible, are temporary. And then over time, that those memorials shift from physical reminders, which do have some drawbacks, to things like honoring the person who died by service, or by having living programs, taking part in suicide prevention events, educating the schools, doing curriculums that really support prevention moving forward, doing a walk, doing sort of other ways to commemorate the life. And again, that's really important that the memorials themselves, whether it's online or in person, value the person's life experience rather than focusing on the elements of death, which can be problematic. And so each community has its own ideas, but I would also recommend working with some folks who are more experienced in suicide prevention as well. And lots of people are willing to help. And there's some recommendations, like I said, in the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, American Association of Suicidology, and a really good book, Suicide in Schools, by Terry Ehrbacher, Jonathan Singer, and Scott Poland. So responsible messaging about after suicide, I'm sort of passionate about this area because it's an area that truly needs a lot of work, and that we do actually know a decent amount about this, but we haven't done a wonderful job of partnering closely with the media in supporting this effort. There are guidelines out there for safe messaging to reduce contagion, stigma, and distress among students. There's the Action Alliance framework for successful messaging, which is out there, and also a project that we worked a lot on with individuals who have lost loved ones to suicide, individuals with lived experience of suicidal behavior, journalists themselves, and folks at the Ohio University Scripps School of Journalism, American Association of Suicidology. We really worked closely to provide guidance that wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It was really about how do you partner and walk journalists through the process of understanding how individuals are affected by suicide, and what we can do to talk about this topic that provides messages of hope, resilience, support, and really educates that community on what resources we do have, what are the risk factors and warning signs, and how can we respond in really practical ways. So we want to get away from the idea that this is something that we're going to hyper focus on the death and the shock and the awe, and really move towards understanding that we have resources. We have really good resources, including folks like OhioHealth and County Law. So our goal is really to change the narrative here and to make it very accessible to the media. So there are definitely examples of good reporting that we have on our site. And this was, again, part of an Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addictions program that was really a collaboration from a lot of folks, and really taking the journalist's perspective on what they want to do and communicating both factual information, but also really making a difference in the community. And I've seen lots of good reporting make a difference in the community. So it's definitely not about wagging your finger at the people who don't do it well. It's about lifting up the people who are able to provide information about what suicide is, what it looks like. It's person-centered and promotes those messages of hope. So again, that good journalism is not going to dwell on method or view suicide as inevitable. It's going to be trying to help those who are affected, give them a framework to understand a really painful part of what's going on. And then these guidelines need to be really accessible. So we've done some stuff like making checklists. We even have magnets. And then on the right, you'll see even Jonathan Singer did a podcast with us, and which is really great. So we just, whether it's on the go, and we know that journalists have a really hard job, and this is a topic that they aren't necessarily expert in. But a real brief story is that someone who was at a news station for about 3 days came to talk about this topic, and there was a young person who lost their life to suicide and was able to use these guidelines and do a pretty credible job just using some of the resources and checklists, and tell a story about a family that mattered without getting into some of the pitfalls that are there. So real quickly, because I really want to get to Lauri's portion on that grief support that's so critical here. Here's a list that I won't go through in detail, but understanding that there are options for the media, especially after there's been a youth suicide, to reduce the risk of contagion by using these strategies. I'm happy if anyone wants to reach out to provide you with those resources and checklists. I'll also say that the American Association of Suicidology has taken these guidelines and added even more resources, and they have a media partnership toolkit that they've created, which would be another excellent resource for journalists. So we also have to be available as suicide prevention folks to help out when journalists do need us, and they want to do a good job. That's my experience. So yeah, we always want to provide those local and national crisis resources highlighted by messages of hope, and understand that people can live very meaningful lives even if they've dealt with suicide loss, or they themselves experience suicidal thoughts and behavior. One last piece that's an evolving element of all of this, and it can be understated how integrated kids are with their social media, and I've seen it even with this grief part of things. When we're at schools and there's been a person who's died by suicide, kids are using their media to reconnect to the past and their final moments, their final conversations with the person who's taken their life. And so then with the Postvention, we need to understand like what's going on in this space and how are the kids communicating. We ideally are very transparently partnering with the youth who are knowledgeable about what's going on in this space. So if there is risk, if there is talk in a way that's harming, that there's trolling, that there's other events going on that might actually put more kids at risk, we want to have partnerships with those kids. But again, we're not sneaking into social media accounts and getting this information, but we're sort of letting the students know. In part of keeping the whole school safe, a really good thing to do would be to keep us informed of whether really inappropriate communications are happening online. And that's going to help us honor that person's life in a responsible way. We want to definitely we understand that social media can be used as a weapon, but it also can be used as a tool for support and connection. So we want to help kids navigate that space in a really helpful way, and what platforms do that and which don't. Make sure they have resources. Unfortunately, social media also can be used to give a lot of resources for crisis support. There's lots of apps out there that are available, and folks can connect in a way that wasn't available before. So those kids who are most isolated, social media may end up being a good outlet for them. Other people may retreat into that space, and that might be really unhealthy for them. So it really is an important part of this. I will mention there's actually a very new tool from out of Australia called Chat Safe, or hashtag Chat Safe, which helps kids know what is helpful and unhelpful ways to talk or to communicate online around suicide on social media. So it's kind of a cool tool. I'm happy to provide a link after the webinar to that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lauri, who's going to help us navigate grief and recovery processes for
I do want to touch on one thing, John, with the social media. Here we're talking about the kind of the immediate postvention with the social media considerations, but I'm working with a couple of schools a year post, a suicide death of a friend. And what I'm finding with working with them in small groups or one-on-one, it's those, all of a sudden, a Snapchat picture of their friend from a year ago, those memories start popping up when they're not asking to see that photo of them at homecoming last year, or of them with their friend doing something a year ago, when they are dealing now with 6 months to a year post a suicide death of a friend. They're not ready for those. And so we're doing a little recovery there too, because they're just going through their phone and checking into their social media sites, whatever they use, and that reminder is right there. That grief becomes very, very fresh and intense.
Oh, that's a great point. I mean, we see that all the time. And now the automated sort of 7 years ago, you were doing this. Well, lots happened in 7 years and et cetera. And so I think that's a really good point, helping kids prepare for that. Because right now, a lot of the social media algorithms are sort of pretty oblivious to that sort of a trigger. And just like that reminder, we want kids to have choice and control over how they grieve and respond to trauma. And when you're getting these surprising sort of pop-ups in your feed, that's really problematic.
Yeah, they can scroll through their own photos, their own gallery, but that's when they're ready for it. But this is something that they may not be prepared for. So we've done a little recovery with that, and a little, kind of talking through their grief at that point when something is that triggering, that intense again.
Yeah, so that's great. Being proactive about it.
Yeah. I'm going to go into a little bit more about the grief response, the immediate and also the longer term grief support. And grief support in terms of postvention is also what John said, good prevention, because we are really trying to take care of these students who are grieving the death of a friend or a classmate. And I think initially and also longer term, working with the school staff to identify who really needs what and when. The highlights, the ones we know right up front are those close friends of a young person who has taken his or her own life, but also kind of branching from that, what clubs might, students in clubs that the friend was in, sports teams, coaches, choir, band, theater, things like that. Identifying those kids who had even peripheral contact with somebody who may be affected. So it might not only be those close friends that we're bringing in that day one, that day two, and kind of longer term. Who else do we need to keep in touch with? Former friends are also kind of key, either those friends who have drifted apart from that young person, or who had been in more recent conflict or had some kind of disagreement in recent times. Also, those students who may have treated that student badly in some way over the years. We may not know about that student or those folks right away, but talking with teachers and kind of the school counselor, and maybe even some of those other students might say, oh yeah, this is somebody who has been in the bathroom crying. We didn't think he or she would be affected, and this is why. There's some, adults in the area that we need to touch base with, teachers and coaches, theater and drama teachers. Sometimes those were teachers and students who had a close relationship, but it also might have been someone who was kind of harsh to that young person. And we had that situation a couple of years ago in a school where a teacher was deeply affected because had recently given a student a bad grade on a paper and really felt a lot of guilt and kind of regret through that. Also, we need to find out from the school officials any students with any prior mental health issues, suicidal ideation, attempts, other grief and loss. And also through this list with, kind of identifying through teachers, counselors, and other students who needs that immediate and also who needs that longer term support. And I think students are also that key. When we're talking with some students, they're like, oh yeah, here's another friend, or here's someone else that we didn't think about that the counselor may not have known about. So that's just something as you're going in for that immediate postvention, making those lists and finding out who needs what and for how long as well. I always like to work kind of around these definitions of grief and loss when we're working with students and also with staff. A lot of kids don't know, and a lot of adults don't really know kind of the background between and the differences between some of these definitions. So when we're talking about grief and providing grief support, that word grief is really defined by our internal reaction in response to a loss. It's not something we get over, it's something we live with. And it's very unique. Grief is unique to each individual. Each individual grieves in their own way, in their own time. And we're working with students in a postvention situation or any kind of even longer term grief support. They might see their grief as different from someone else's, but judge someone else based on how they're reacting. And we try to talk with students about grief is your internal response. We don't know everyone else's story. So even if someone was not a good friend of the person who died, the person who took his or her own life, they're grieving, and that's okay. Everyone has their own unique way of dealing with their grief. Grief is that internal. It affects us emotionally, physically, behaviorally, cognitively, and spiritually. So that is our internal reaction, which is important to know. And then that mourning, we talk about, people in a period of mourning or that outward mourning, that's that outward expression of the grief, how we show those thoughts and feelings. And that's really important when we're working with young people in the postvention kind of realm, because that's the memorialization. That's how, the candlelight vigils come about. It's that outward expression of that grief. And it's healthy to mourn, and healing involves mourning that loss. And those students who are keeping that grief in and not being able to outwardly express that grief or mourn, those are the ones that are going to have longer term effects from that grief reaction and that mourning, not being allowed to mourn outwardly. And then that last definition on your slide is more about trauma. And traumatic events create a response as well. And that response is normal. When we've been exposed or we've heard or we've witnessed a traumatic event, we have a normal response because it's our internal response that we can't necessarily control, but it's a normal response to an abnormal event. And we'll go through a little bit more about some of the trauma reactions here in a minute. We also operate in terms of our grief support programs individually and in groups with the understanding that grief is active. So tasks of grief for children and adolescents is based on Sandra Fox's kind of theories and work with kids. The tasks of grief are not linear. It's not a stage approach in which once we accept that the death has happened, then we move on to another stage, and then grief is over. We know that grief is lifelong. But while we're operating and working with kids, we kind of go under under these tasks. And that first task is understanding, helping kids tell their story. A young person telling their story about their friend and how they heard the news that their friend had taken his or her own life. So understanding that person is no longer alive. And it doesn't mean that once a young person tells their story about their loss, then they don't need to tell it again. They need to repeat that story. They need to have that safe place, that trusting environment to continue to talk about their friend or their classmate or their loved one. And then the next task is grieving. And it's really that expression of grief, expression of the feeling that pain of the loss. And again, when we're working with young people, either individually or in groups over time, identifying feelings, healthy ways of expressing feelings, helping them normalize helping normalize and validate that all of those feelings are okay and they're all a part of their response to their loss, and that they may not be grieving or expressing their grief in the way that someone else is. That's okay. Their grief is their grief. Someone else's grief is their grief, and getting them to understand those kinds of things, that they can look around the room in a care room after a suicide death of a friend. Everyone is expressing it in different ways. The next task is commemorating, remembering, celebrating, talking through memories and celebrating that person's life. And going on, we don't like to say that grief is over, or that we move on, or that we get over, or that we forget. It's just being able to function and celebrate and celebrate that person's life while being able to move forward. And again, we go back and forth in those tasks of grief over time, and it's not like once one task is over, we go on to the next one. It's all kind of combined. A little bit about grief and trauma. We know that grief is that internal response to loss, and the generalized feeling with grief. If someone has died, maybe a natural death, or someone who has lived a long life and we had more ways of anticipating it, the generalized feeling is sadness. When we're talking about a traumatic event, it's really that perception of the event, perception of that person's death, that creates some internal trauma response. And the generalized feeling there is either fear or terror. With grief, our pain is related to the loss. And with a traumatic event, the pain is related to the terror or a lack of safety, fear for safety. A teen or child or teen's anger is not usually destructive, either self-destructive or outwardly destructive, when it's kind of a normal grieving process. When there's a traumatic response, that anger can become more assaultive, either self-harm or harming others. With grief, we can usually get kids to talk about that person, talk about their loss. A lot of times with a traumatic event, that takes a while to get to. And pain is the acknowledgement of the loss with grief. That pain with a traumatic event triggers that loss of safety and more vulnerability. So when we're working with kids in a school setting who have experienced the loss of a friend or a family member to suicide or homicide or a drug overdose, we're kind of touching base on both of these things: the grief, the addressing the loss of that person with a traumatic event. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are lots of different reactions to trauma that affect a child and also adults physically, that may seem like anxiety or panic attacks. They actually, that trauma is stored in the memory, stored in the brain, and that trauma, when there's a trigger to it, brings that event back very, very close to the surface, like that child or that student is experiencing it all over again. So many of these reactions are stored in the memory if there is a trigger to that traumatic event. Okay. The important thing to know about trauma is just normalizing that with the young person and letting them know that this is their response and it is also very normal, but helping them with some strategies that help them feel like they can get back to a state of self-regulation. And it might be through journaling, music, stress balls, having a certain deep breathing, yoga, what helps them get themselves kind of self-regulated to a place where that trauma, that response, that physiological response, something that calms them back down. Grief support, we could talk about trauma probably all day, but I'm going to go into some more information about grief support, either small group or one-to-one support. These sessions, either whether it's the first couple of days after a suicide death of a friend or a classmate, or if it's the longer term, we're doing just a few things. We're normalizing and validating that grief. So we're providing a little grief education about how a death impacts us. We're allowing students to share their story, how they know their friend, those unique things about the person that they have cared about over time, how they heard how they heard the news, their reactions and feelings, and again, validating and listening to their story. Whether it's immediate postvention or longer term, we're focusing on some of those commemorative discussions and activities. This might be something that we're doing day 1 or day 2 of postvention, or into the months following, helping them find things that help them with their sharing memories and also making something to remember their loved one and their friend. This is more of the ongoing grief support, allowing them to grieve the loss, increasing mental health awareness. And something I was talking about with the trauma piece is those self-care techniques. So talking with those students, either one-on-one or in small groups, what have you typically done to manage stress, frustration, sadness prior to the death? Helping those students brainstorm, well, last year when my grandma died, this is what I did. This is what helped me. Or if I'm stressed about a relationship with a friend, this is what I do. And so then we talk about what they can do now, who are their supports. Some of those strategies are listed there, and those are really good self-help strategies for all of us and self-care strategies for all of us. And then in our small group or individual setting, we might be doing some of those things, some of that debriefing, some of that self-care, some of those relaxation techniques.
It looks like a lot of the ones that you've chosen have like sort of grounding properties or mindfulness, where you're sort of taking someone who's really focused on some of this pain from the past and bringing it forward. Is that fair?
I think it is. I think allowing them to share what they're feeling, sharing those reactions, like when I think about it, this is what I think, and this is where I feel it in my body. This is what my brain is doing. This is my heart is racing. My hands are clammy. Okay, then what are some of your strategies, and being able to talk through that. We might have coloring pages, we might make stress balls, we might do some things, and then doing a before and after our 45 minutes with them. How did you feel before? How did you feel during? How do you feel now? And then do you feel like you can get yourself back to class? Who do you have for support when you get home tonight? Absolutely.
Right, and kind of understanding that it's like other forms of therapy. It's not going to, everything is not going to work equally well for the same person. So lots of different options there to help the person figure out how they can exert the most control and support in their own life and get them back to feeling as well as they can, given the reality of grief.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about what they do for relaxation on a typical, during a typical time, but when it gets heightened right now, what can you do? And with students in schools, either, elementary through high school, do they need a pass? We talk about a fast pass. If they start to feel it bubbling up in class, or there's a trigger during English class because they're doing a reading and it's about grief, or it's about a suicide or mental health, how do you get yourself from that place to a place of safety, which is maybe getting to the counselor's office, getting to the clinic. Those kinds of things we talk with students about, and also talk with the school administration.
Yeah, well, the administrator is a big deal because if they're assuming that getting a kid who's struggling and grieving back to class ASAP instead of managing the grief, they've actually are undermining their own goals of getting
absolutely, because they're not able to sit in class and focus and listen and move forward that way either. Yes. Ongoing considerations, weekly or monthly support groups. I just talked a lot about groups and a lot about some of those techniques for grief support, but thinking about that time moving forward, who are those students who could benefit from weekly sessions? Last year, we, I think, provided 8 different ongoing support groups for schools following the suicide death of a friend. And those were one time a week with a small group for about 8 sessions, and going through a lot of those things that I just talked about with the grief support. But who were those students who really could benefit from that? Then they were getting out of class once a week to be able to really take care of themselves and take care of their own mental health while grieve the death of their friend. Some other ongoing considerations, mental health awareness activities for the student body, self-care workshops for students and staff, mini classes that incorporate things like art, music therapy, walking, yoga, journaling, and things like that. Working with the school this past year as they were coming up on a 1-year anniversary time of a suicide death of a student, they really focused on getting the school leadership involved in how can we commemorate as well as promote positive mental health. And this is what they chose to do prior to the anniversary date of their friend, is put a self-care day together for them, for the whole student body, which was really amazing.
Very quickly, we do have another question from Nicole Brown. How do you handle a suicide of a student that was bullied in school and all of the students know that they were bullied?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've encountered a few different times, and we know that bullying in any of its forms, whether it be the person who gets bullied or the person who's bullying others, is problematic and actually increases the risk of suicide for all involved. I think it's an opportunity for the school to define its stance on these types of behaviors, but kind of separate it from the idea that this bullying inherently caused this suicide death, that it's an opportunity to explain that suicide is complex and people are affected, especially in social situations, in different ways. It is okay to suggest that bullying is not something your school will tolerate, and that it does impact people's emotional and physical health, to be very direct about those sorts of things. But I don't think it's very helpful at all to have a message that the bullying itself caused the suicide death, that this is the sole explanation in this set of events that unfolded, that this was what happened. You're going to have a lot of students feeling tremendous amounts of guilt. You're going to have parents that jump on board, and media stories and other folks that jump onto this narrative that suggest this is exactly what happened and that they know all of the details of the situation. Where every story that I've gone into, there's lots of factors. There's historical trauma. There's access to lethal means. There's a lack of prevention culture. There's all sorts of things, and we could go on and list them. But I think we want to address the grief and the guilt experienced by those who feel like they may have had a role. So that's number one. I think Lauri got into that really well. And then you want to make sure that on top of that, the school is taking proactive steps to address what's going on. But really, I would separate the narrative. I guess that's my recommendation. Separate the narrative of, bullying was the sole reason this person took their life. And we need to do bullying intervention to solve this suicide specific problem that may be encountering all schools. So there's a nice CDC resource on the relationship between bullying and suicide prevention. Happy to share that link. But we really need to be careful to separate those things, but also support the kids, because we do know that when there's a lack of connection, hopelessness, rejection, invalidation for who the person is, whether it be a factor about that person or just overall rejection, that's not setting a person up for good mental health. And there is an association between increased bullying and increased suicide risk. So it gets complicated. I would be very thoughtful about crafting that. I'm not going to do it justice in 2 minutes here, but it's a great question, and we have to work with everyone involved to craft that message.
Yeah, and I think if we were addressing some of those students who may be feeling some of that guilt about how they treated a young person, doing that individually rather than in a group. If we had some names and we would really just do that individually and dispel some of those myths and hear from their perspective, but making sure that they know that what they did or what they did not do did not cause that. But I would not do that in a group format. I would do that individually.
Yeah, 100% agree with
that. Family and community support, this goes along with the immediate postvention as well as kind of ongoing, knowing in your area what the resources are in terms of providing grief support and anything that family might need, as well as others in the community that might be impacted by that young person's death, other coaches, music groups, other organizations. But before reaching out, or if you are the folks that would be reaching out, making sure you know if there are resources available, if there are support groups in the area, if there is a area loss team that could help that family out, or those staff members or volunteers in those other organizations as well. There may be hospices in your area or other mental health programs that offer grief support, either groups or workshops and things like that. And John touched on this earlier, is kind of thinking through that next year and what are those significant dates and events within the school community that the administration, that the counseling team needs to know about. The student's birthday coming up, different events like homecoming or prom, athletic events, senior nights in high schools, that senior night where a young person is not there, but that senior would have been honored at the football game or at the basketball game, anniversary date of the death, graduation, things like that. Evaluate what to do for the students, for the classmates, but always respecting and making sure that there's some consultation with the family of the student who died as well. John, you could probably speak a little more to that, but I mean, it's a little bit about the memorialization, but it's thinking longer term, thinking about those things that may not even be on your radar. Oh my gosh, this is coming up, prom is coming up. How do we support our students?
Yeah, I think it's about being planful and understanding that kids will have a reaction one way or the other, and helping them prepare, helping the ones who were, the folks who are close, but also those who looked up to that individual, and the reminders that are coming. So it's a series of discussions. We sort of take the approach of never worrying alone. If you're working with a group of individuals, hopefully you have someone who's navigating this space and can really just think through these issues, because there's, like I said before, in a lot of these, there's not this clear cut, this is the best way to do it in 100% of situations. We know a little bit more about what not to do, but there's creative solutions, and if it's kind of meets that criteria of honoring their person and their life, and the people who are you have some control about how that's going to be celebrated over time, that can be really helpful.
I just have a brief note. We most likely will not finish in the next 3 minutes, but if you absolutely have to get off, we totally understand. But if you're able to make it, that's great. We will be sending out the recording and follow-up notes in these slides as well. So just be aware of that.
So Lauri just touched on this. Really, over time, a school district that's experienced a student suicide will benefit from keeping an eye to the past as well as an eye to the future and how the kids are doing. We discussed the grief processes, that they move at their own pace, and some students and staff may be dealing with a lot of unresolved or even complicated grief that isn't following that normal path. And so these following tasks are going to help with the school think about what to pay attention to in the months and years after. We want to definitely keep checking in with those kids who might be at the most vulnerable, whether it's the kids who were very close, the kids who were in the same organizations, also those in the periphery of their social networks have been shown to be at pretty high risk as well. So kind of continuing to use strategies to do that, and that may involve evidence-based risk assessments and safety planning approaches. So making sure that there are some people internal to your school that have the opportunity to know how to check in on folks and do screening or risk assessment and safety planning, and then acknowledging those anniversaries that we just spoke about. And then when the grief does remain really impairing or distressing, making sure that you've got a community referral network, professionals who not only are linked with the major mental health organizations, but also those specific to the cultural needs of those who are most impacted, who can really understand what they're dealing with there.
And then, John, in one of my situations, we did an 8-week program right after the death of a friend in the school. And then this year we have continued to do monthly support groups for that particular group.
Yeah, I think those are wonderful.
If you can. Yeah, it's not possible in every situation though.
And we're not going to get into this. I just added a few slides about maybe some best practice strategies for using screening and risk assessment tools. So there are some tools validated for young children to be used as screeners. One is the Ask Suicide Screening Questionnaire, and that's actually a 4 to 5 question instrument that's been distilled from like the suicidal ideation questionnaire junior and other things, where it's validated to have the most predictive questions included. So it's very short, 4 questions about specific, concrete about suicide risk, and then 1 follow-up question if they're imminently thinking about ending their life or attempting suicide. Then there's some other tools like the BSAD that's part of the Signs of Suicide curriculum, and the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale screener. And so what we do know, I just want to point out here, suicide screening has not been found to increase suicidal thoughts. It does not increase distress significantly. So screening gives kids the opportunity who are experiencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors the opportunity to disclose this and to get support from the adults around it. And it doesn't put the idea in anyone's mind. We do know, however, that some of the highest risk students may not seek help and may not reach out. So screening can really be an opportunity to give them another avenue to report some concerns. And it doesn't mean you're still not trying to pay attention to those warning signs and risk factors, because you could have kids who are very committed not to disclosing their level of distress as well. So using our good judgment as well. And then a lot of times when you then have to have a strategy after screening has occurred to follow up with these kids. So you can't just give screening and then not have a really clear plan in place on how you're going to respond to risk. And that's something, again, I'd be happy to follow up with people on. So here we have a way that we within our center advocate for responding to positive screens. We use the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, for example, which is a tool that's free, open access online with trainings online through the Lighthouse Project, through the Columbia website. And we also do screenings or trainings locally to enhance providers' ability to do that well, and just have a clear process after that screening has occurred. What requires immediate follow-up, what can be followed up in the next several days. So clearly, if they're endorsing current suicidal behavior or even very recent suicidal thinking or behavior, we're going to respond immediately that day. We're not sending kids home on the bus, for example. So there's, we want to have a clear pathway for that. Which I think is outside the scope of this webinar, but just wanted to let folks know that there's a need for a pathway for that support, and that the administration of the school needs to understand what that looks like and when they need to step in and make sure their policy is clearly enforced by everyone involved, and then make sure that you've got both internal support at the school for risk assessment and safety planning, and then be knowledgeable of local mental health providers so that we're giving families choice and we're giving them the ability to consent to these processes as well. So really, the last piece that we want to focus on is the idea that good postvention is going to funnel into good prevention. So as the school and community continue to heal, we are going to be at a place where they should be in about the course of the next 3 to 4 months after a suicide, not before typically, because they're still immersed in grieving, and sometimes longer than that 3 to 4 months, because it could be a kind of a more complicated situation where folks are not ready to move on into prevention, or there could be a lot of guilt and shame, or we could be dealing with multiple suicides in a school, and so all those factors play into the timeline. But typically after that 3 to 6 months, it is okay to move onward towards prevention, and we're going to always recommend evidence-based prevention strategies. There are a number out there. We personally do the SOS Signs of Suicide curriculum in an enhanced way, but there are also great programs like Cognito, Hope Squad, Mental Health First Aid, Source of Strength. There's really a number of good programs, so we're not necessarily saying there's only one option here, but we do want to move towards prevention, because ultimately that's going to help keep kids safer and allow them the tools to identify and respond to the warning signs. So really, I think given the time, we'll actually not go through the details of this Signs of Suicide program, but understand that anytime you are looking through a suicide prevention program, you want the adults and the students to be able to know how to respond, what to look for, and really sort of dispel the myths, but then give them action steps. And for us, for the Signs of Suicide program, it's this acronym ACT. So acknowledge that you see pain and someone showing warning signs of suicide, that you care and show that you want to help in the way that's most natural to you, and then tell a trusted adult. We don't want the kids taking on the burden, especially if they've had a recent loss of suicide, and someone says, don't tell anyone, and I'll deal with it. I mean, if someone was having a seizure or was on fire and asked us not to respond, we would never do it. And we know from the statistics that youth suicide is a leading cause of death, and we need to be able to respond both with urgency and compassion. So really making sure the kids know this is not their burden to hold. They are not, it's not necessary, and they are not a snitch, or they're not doing something problematic by sharing this and sharing that burden. And so kind of with that said, across the board, I think the final piece that I'll say is that schools and practitioners and those involved in postvention should never worry alone. It's very important and critical it's been critical for all of us involved in postvention here in Franklin County to make sure that we're involving all the stakeholders. We're not worrying alone. We're involving a host of community stakeholders, and it really cuts across sort of community leaders, mental health, hospitals, clergy, key cultural brokers, schools. This list is not even comprehensive of that. And then linking with folks who just do this suicide prevention work for a living and have the perspectives of when things go well and when things start to go awry. So, and then at the end of the day, the activities need to be consistent with school policy. So it is an opportunity to help schools think about, do we have suicide-specific policies in place that are effective and also, kind of most in line with what we know about kids healing after a suicide loss, and that resources are available throughout the area. So I will stop there. If there, and actually I'll highlight these great resources. I've drawn from them, the folks who put these together, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, where Sean is now, right?
Yes. Yep.
and those are just wonderful agencies. And then the Suicide in Schools book, just tremendous, and sort of the gold standard, I think, of suicide work in schools, and it covers things with great case examples and really is practical in how it applies things. So if you are able to take a look at those, I'd highly recommend them. And then, so I'll stop there and thank you for your time and attention, and turn it over to Lauri for a last word.
I just want to thank you all for being concerned about this issue and being ready and willing to provide support to these young people in your area, in your community. Because if you're on this today and you're looking at postvention for elementary schools through high schools, you have it in your heart to be a really good resource. So I appreciate your time.
Well said.
Yes, and thank you again, Dr. Ackerman and Lauri. It's informative as always. But I also want to thank all of you, the 28 of you that stayed afterwards. If you do have any questions, just feel free to chat, put them in the chat box. There's also the Q&A section as well. We can take just a couple more minutes if you're all willing, if there's any pressing questions. And of course, we will be sending out all of these resources that are on the slides, the slide deck, the recording as well, and any additional resources that either Dr. Ackerman or Lauri mentioned.
And our contact information is on the next slide, so feel free to give me a call or email somewhere there. There it is. Feel free to give me a call and leave a message. I'd be happy to chat with you, or my email is up there as well. And John's. John's is there.
Thank you, everyone, and feel free to reach out. Appreciate the work that you're doing.
All right, last call for questions. Last call. All right, well, I will stop the recording now, and you'll expect to receive an email this week with follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you. So how many were on?